I'm talking about body rhythms today, which is one of my special topics or fields where I am looking from the perspective of the Kestenberg Movement Profile, which is one of the instruments that actually makes explicit connections between movement and meaning in the sense of psychological meaning, also useful for psychodiagnosis, interventions that can be built on these views. So we use it in clinical practice with patients, but it comes from a broader perspective. So let me start. First thing I wanted to quote Merleau-Ponty. He says, what light is for seeing, body movement is for feeling. And just a brief organizer, and you are all familiar with these facts, but just a brief organizer. Movement is a central cue, which we use to infer intentions, motivations, and cause-effect relations. We know that since a long time. It is a basic dimension of our perception, and one of the first concepts that we acquire from developmental psychology. It is the characteristic of living systems, and it's on many levels connected to our minds. Judith Kestenberg was actually making a genius move with the connection of movement and meaning, I think. She based her Kestenberg movement profile on psychoanalysis from Anna Freud on the one side, and on movement analysis from Laban and Warren Lamb on the other side, and brought those two together in a unique way. And I think there's much to learn from how she brought that together. She started in the 50s already with working with autistic children and getting very interested in how they communicate their needs. And one of the major way for them to communicate their needs was through bodily rhythms. And that's what she was getting very interested in. And she started to develop a system of notation of how to actually notate these rhythms and how to make sense of what comes through them. But rhythms is just one of the 9 profiles, but we're going to talk about the rhythms today because there's so much more, but I only have 20 minutes. So let's keep with the rhythms today. The entire system is actually having the aim to give us a fine-grained analysis of full body movement and nonverbal behavior of the body and connections to meaning, as I already said. It is a theory system in its own right and allows us the derivation of numerous hypotheses about the relation of movement and meaning, and its use in clinical diagnosis and treatment planning. Also in interaction, to look at interactional misunderstandings and not good communication, like for example in babies and parents when we have a scream babies. Is that is there something like a vicious circle developing, or between partners in the nonverbal, totally in the nonverbal? And we can look at that in a very fine-grained way with the Kestenberg Movement Profile. So it gives us information, the system gives us information about the needs and the temperament and the affect and the learning styles, the defense mechanisms people have, the coping mechanisms, and self and other related feelings and relations to the environment and to the people in the direct surrounding. It's applied, I already said that. Kestenberg basically looks at 2 dimensions, the movement qualities and the movement shapes. And part of the movement qualities are the movement rhythms, which are unconscious movements that we all use. And she distinguishes 10 of those patterns in a developmental sequence, and they are characterized by being either an indulgent or a fighting rhythm, which has either smooth or sharp reversals or transitions in the rhythm itself. We'll see more about that in just a minute. So these are the 9 profiles that Kestenberg gives us in total. We're looking at the rhythms only. So that's the upper left here. And the rhythms attributes, you can read all of that, but we're only going to talk about the rhythms. From top to bottom, it's the more and more conscious movement. So we have the very unconscious movement, like the rhythms and the shape flow movements. These are tension flow changes in the body. So I'm getting tenser, I'm getting more relaxed, I'm constantly changing my tension in the body, and that's what the rhythms are actually capturing. And I also have this constant flow in my shape changes. I'm moving towards something, moving away from something, boom. And this is captured in the shape flow patterns on that side. So today, just the rhythms. There's other principles here. This is all about movement qualities on this side. So the full-blown, willing, full movement would be efforts, the Laban efforts. Most of you are familiar with that. So this is when I'm on stage, for example, right? Today we also have pedestrian movement on stage, then that would be somewhere in between these two poles. Genau, movement shapes, the same thing. So these are all diagrams about movement shapes, how the body grows and shrinks in movement, how it approaches and avoids people and objects. And it's going by developmental years. So we have 6 of those qualifiers, and they go by first, second, and third developmental year. That's when they actually develop. This is a movement profile of a 2.5 months old baby. So what we basically do is we draw a line, just a timeline, plain timeline. Then we put our pencil on the paper and we use our bodies and our kinesthetic empathy as a seismograph, like in a seismograph, to draw, more bound, body's getting more bound, body's getting more free, body's getting more bound, more free. Boom, there's something else happening, boom. There's nothing happening, parallel line to the baseline. So above the line means free flow and below the line means bound flow. And you can see these alterations and these pulsating, things that are all about the body rhythms and the tension flow changes in the body. And what we do in the Kestenberg Movement Profile is then we actually define the rhythms and we count them and then we categorize them and then we get an impression of whether the person has a balanced rhythm profile or whether there's something missing, like the second developmental year entirely missing, what happened in the second developmental year and stuff like that, because it's stemming from psychoanalysis. So you use it also for these kinds of interpretations, but it gives us more than that. It gives us a continuous way of looking at affect expressions. It's very closely related to what Daniel Stern called vitality affects, who he did the same thing. He was actually aware of Kestenberg's research. He said we need a timeline and then we need an intensity of movement, and we can actually draw these lines about the qualities of movement. He says, for example, exploding or pulsing or fading can all be drawn in this way. These are the 10 developmental rhythms that Kestenberg came up with, and she came up with those by observing 3 babies from the start of one of her friends. So very similar to Piaget, how Piaget did his theorizing about cognitive development. She observed 3 children very intimately across 20 years in order to come up with this system of how movement develops in this way. And this is the rhythms she came up with. So she says in the first year we have the oral rhythms develop. That makes a lot of sense because when the baby is born, they can already suck. So the first thing you see here is the sucking rhythm, right? It's a low intensity rhythm. It looks almost like a sinus curve. It has a high frequency and it has a low intensity. And then when the teeth set in and start to break through, that's when the baby starts to do biting rhythm, which is the first rhythm with sharp transitions. So it's getting more like this. I'm showing it with my hand, if you can see it. So from the smooth sucking rhythm, we go into a biting rhythm where there is a sharp transition, a sharp reversal in the rhythm. And then, of course, second year, we go into twisting rhythms, playful mode, like that, for example. And then when you start to, potty training, anal rhythms, when you start to go into high intensity, you strain and you press and then you release. So this is how the rhythms develop and how we look at them. And they are the basic qualities, the unconscious movement qualities, the first qualities that develop in the body. So for example, sucking rhythm is a regular pattern, and it's the first thing the child can actually willingly produce. So it's used in, experiments of developmental psychologists, but it also spreads, or the children use it then in other parts of their bodies. So it kind of starts to organize the entire body. And that's how we start to organize our willingly influenced tension flow, basically, in the beginning of life. We can observe these rhythms in music also. So all the lullabies around the globe consist of those sucking rhythms, actually. If you write them, you can write music in terms of these rhythms as well, because they also have created tension and have a pulse. You can observe tango in the starting-stopping rhythm. The disco dancing is a mix of the indulgent swaying and the jumping rhythm, and so on. So, hip hop has a lot of these ballistic movements. You can look at art and find those rhythms in art. So there's twisting rhythm in the skies of Van Gogh here, and there's biting rhythm in the cornfields. Also the way it was drawn using these rhythms in the body. Of course, in Kandinsky, you have a lot of smooth and also sharp, rhythms that you can use and even dance. And Merleau-Ponty is also telling us about synergies. And he says the synergies are actually the unity of the senses in movement. So movement is the basis of the synergetic experience, and he elaborates on that. In my own experimental research, we used these rhythms and did experiments with the indulgent and the fighting rhythms, indulgent versus fighting rhythms, and we found that the fighting rhythms would always create more negative affect. The indulgent rhythms would always create more positive affect in different types of rhythms that we tested one against the other. And when we combined that with approach and avoidance motor behavior, like smooth approach movement, smooth avoidance movement, sharp approach movement, sharp avoidance movement towards and away from the body, that's when we found an influence on affect. Of course, smooth caused more positive affect, as we found it before, but also on attitudes, which was interesting. So the smooth approach movement towards the body caused the most positive attitudes towards arbitrary Chinese ideographs that we showed these people. And smooth movement away from the body caused the least positive attitude, or the most negative attitude. And interestingly enough, when we did the sharp movement towards or away from the body, it didn't cause a difference. And we explained this in a way that we think that when you use sharp movement, particularly towards, but also away from the body towards those signs, these Chinese signal signs, that you are getting in a kind of defensive mode, so that you don't let these objects get to you anymore in the way that you do when you're just using smooth rhythms, right? So that was our explanation, that defensive mode would actually prevent us from an evaluative bias, because we're getting in this defensive mode. So to sum this up, the movement rhythms are working on affect, and they create more negative affect when they are sharp, and more positive when they are round. And the round rhythms also create more positive attitudes. And the movement qualities have just as big of an influence as the movement shape changes, which we knew from psychology before, but movement qualities are having an equally big influence on affect and attitudes. And they also have an effect on cognition that there's another literature here that we found later on, not in the original experiment. Let me get to my last point that I want to make today. We also looked at the communicative function of these body rhythms, and we looked in two studies. First study, we took handshakes, and we had a handshaker, which was always the same person, trained in using the rhythms, either in a smooth or in a sharp way. And what we found was that smooth rhythms were found to indicate more positive affect, and were related to the personality dimensions of agreeableness, openness, and extroversion. And the sharp rhythms were related to perceived neuroticism in the person who was shaking the hand and using the sharp rhythms. So that was interesting. And then we did the embrace study. We looked at rhythms, how they are used when you embrace other people. Because usually when we embrace, and Kestenberg described that, we use a smooth rhythm first. And then at a certain point, we start to use a sharp rhythm. And that's usually the signal to separate, to part from each other. So we wanted to check whether that is actually the way we can observe it. And we observed in Mensa of the student, where the students eat, and we observed on train stations. And we found that, yes, this is actually the way people do embrace. First, they use the indulgent rhythms, and then they start to tap or pat at a certain point, and that's usually understood as a signal of separation. Interestingly enough, there was a gender difference, because when we observed two men hugging, then they would pat right away. There wouldn't be an indulgent face usually. So much to the homophobia in our society. And then we said, okay, let's do an experiment on basis of what we've observed. And we created a setting where we had one person hug 60 other persons, and she hugged into sequences: smooth, smooth, sharp, or smooth, sharp, smooth. And we had those people, they were blindfolded to not see their hugger, and because it was also somebody from their semester. And they had a handkerchief in their hands, and we said, please drop that handkerchief as when you perceive a signal of separation in the hug. And most of the people actually dropped that handkerchief in the sharp sequence. So in sequence A at the end, and in sequence B in the middle. We learned that 75 to 80% of the participant understood the signal to separate in the sharp rhythm. So it's not all of us that understand this signal, but most of us. And then, of course, you can do a lot more intricate analyses of interaction between mothers and children, between partners, and very interesting also to look at the shape changes. That would be a totally different presentation, and I'm not going there today, just jumping a little over it, but spatial bias research has helped us to find out what movement directions are actually connected to psychologically, and the Kestenberg Movement Profile gives us more further detailed cues on that as well. Let me sum this up and just draw 3 conclusions. So rhythms communicate needs, and we use them intuitively to express our needs and to understand also what children or other nonverbal agents want to communicate to us. Animals, for example, what does our dog want to tell us? There is a self-regulative and a communicative function of bodily expressions, and rhythms and shape changes influence affect and attitudes to just a high degree, like the rhythms are as important as the shape changes of approach and avoidance motor behavior. And this is, of course, useful for the clinician in dance therapy, my field. We work in the clinics with severely impaired patients, and it gives us cues about clinical diagnosis and intervention for our work. And this is the Kestenberg community. Yes, the late Judith Kestenberg sitting here next to her, Susan Lohman, and Janet Kestenberg, her daughter, who wrote the Kestenberg book, the second one, Mark Sossin here in the background. And this is about, 30 years later, Mark Sossin in the older version, here's Warren Lamb when he was still alive, and Susan Lohman, who looks just like the same as 30 years before. Very impressive. So just for a personal glance in the end. And then a couple of literature. And that's it from me today. I hope I kept the time so that you get your break. I'm not sure. I'm before the lunch break. Are you hearing something else?
Yes, no.
If you have questions, please, I'm very happy about questions and also your comments.
Thank you so much, Sabina. Valentina, you can take over. Otherwise, I'm here to help with the question. But we'll first give Sabina a huge round of applause.
Is there any question from the audience there?
Are there questions? I mean, I'm sure there are many questions, but is there anybody who's brave enough to look after that epic? I have one straight off the bat. So Sabina, I do a bit of work on touch and lullaby. So I was extremely happy to hear you talk about the communicative value of particular of the waveforms through touch and then linking that through to lullabies. And so if you have anything more to say on that, any nuggets that I can steal from you, I'd be grateful to hear about how you think these rhythms work mechanistically speaking.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Why don't you send me a paper of yours and I'll look at it, because then I get probably a lot of ideas of how we can connect things there. That would be a suggestion of mine. I would be very happy.
No problem. We'll do that.
And of course, I mean, there's so many things to say that I don't know where to start, actually.
We will literally lap it all up. We will eat it up.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's do it maybe by just exchanging more. I'll be really happy to
happy to do so. Happy to do so.
More.
We have a question from the audience. Asaf?
Yeah, thank you. This is beautiful work. I'm also interested to ask a question about the hugging study. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the 20% or so that did not correspond to the theory, and also related to that, if you have any already experience or thought about the cross-cultural studies, like terms of work in Japan, I know by Junji Watanabe and others on effective communicative touch. There's other things, and I'm wondering if, just where it's not always the same. I'm just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be interesting as a cross-cultural, because hugging just has so many different meanings. In some societies, you don't do it at all, and in others, you do it constantly. So that I would expect a difference there, of course. We found in the hugging, well, let me maybe start the other way around. You asked about the cross-cultural, and what was your question before, Asaf?
What about the 20% that don't?
The 20%, of course. I think different reasons there. Of course, we experience that doesn't work for some people when we hug people, because some people just won't let go when we give the signal, right? So we all have made that experience. And this may have different reasons. We know that maybe in a person who is more autistic, it's more difficult to decipher these things. So it may be due to that. It may be due to a motivational problem that people don't let go, right? But yeah, and also in our study, of course, that's an artificial setting. So we did it in the lab. And I think there were a couple of people who wanted to be extra clever and maybe didn't use the signal. I know that we had a couple of people who stayed connected longer than the signal in the end, and they just didn't let go because they had hypotheses about what we wanted to test. So that is an artificial one, of course. So there's all kinds of reasons. I think these are the three ones that I can come up with at the moment, but there may be more.
Teachers at a finger or a thought?
There's a question on YouTube.
Yeah, please. Can you?
Okay. Hi, Sabine. Thank you for a very exciting talk. And this is new to me, so it might be a stupid question or two stupid questions, but I'll ask anyways. Be forgive me. Partly, I was thinking if these rhythmic forms are thought to be culture dependent and also how they're interpreted, or universal, or maybe a bit of both. And partly I was wondering, because as I've earlier on said that it's nice to use these images when you describe things. So instead of saying, lift your hand 3 centimeters then to the right, or you say something like, follow your hand through the horizon or something, and then a dancer will know what to do. And I was just thinking if these rhythmic forms should be thought of as images like this, or more as concrete physical characteristics of the movement, if that question makes sense.
Yeah. They're meant as concrete physical, actually, because they are about tension flow. So they're really about the muscle flow changes that you are, using. And the meanings then related to it, and the meaning is also related to the development of them as through the Kestenberg. I think there's definitely intercultural differences. We don't have a lot of studies about that. I know that Janet Kestenberg has been working in Bali, and she made a couple of studies in Bali. And also Susan Lohman has a couple of intercultural observations of people being more direct or indirect in certain cultures. And that's more about the efforts, of course, at that moment. But the rhythms, I think, should be pretty similar because they are so unconscious and they're so early in the development. They're prelingual, right? So that I would expect more equity there across the cultures than in the efforts that are much more culture specific. But that's a very interesting question, and we don't have a lot of research on it at least in the Laban and Kestenberg community. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And then I think, Valentina, you have a question?
I think it's more of a curiosity, Sabine. As anyone, I mean, you're someone else from the Laban community, customer community, has ever used, for example, a way for tracking, I don't know, tracking the change in the rhythm and this vocabulary movement to track, for example, developmentally in kids. I'm thinking about like children with autism spectrum condition where they have a very specific, movement vocabulary. I'm thinking about repetitions and things so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering whether, from clinical point of view, if has anyone, thoughts or has used this type of, technique.
Yeah, I mean, even Judith Kestenberg herself did a couple of longer-term studies with the autistic children she was treating. But interestingly enough, we don't have yet a large-scale development on how to measure this technically. I know that in Japan, a colleague of us is working on a technical device that can help us measure the rhythms. I mean, you could probably measure them with EMG, right? But even that, nobody has tried that yet, whether we come up with, whether the observer comes up with the same conclusions, categories, numbers, frequencies, then the EMG would actually. So these are all very interesting questions that haven't been really looked at, and it would be interesting, of course, to do that. Okay. So it's Yukari that is looking at that in Japan. I'm blanking on her last name, but if anybody's interested, I'm very happy to make a connection. I have a poster from her, and there's her contact info on there.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any last questions from the room? That was supposed to be more inviting as a question. Otherwise, Sabina, we are exactly on time, and hopefully this means that you can take a deep breath before whatever next busy thing is waiting for you. We're very grateful. One last round of applause for Sabina.
Thank you, guys. Have a great conference.